Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Haunting Us podcast. Before I got started today, I did want to say something. Just from one of the comments I got, I'm relatively new to the space, this community of like podcasting, researching stuff like this. So I am gonna screw up from time to time. Um, I am also a writer, so there's a difference in the storytelling terminology that like I want to use because of how I write, and then like the technical side of things on like nonfiction and research. I'm gonna mix things up every now and then. I might say the wrong word in comparison to like what it should be, but I just wanted to like put that out there so just so I can, as I'm growing, you'll see that I'm improving. So yeah, that being said, this episode is something that I've spent time researching both within the last week, but also in the past, because it is also in the state of Maine, and that is the Purrington Massacre. So, for this moment in time, we will be traveling back to the early hours of July 9th, 1806. But before we get there, we go even farther back to 1760, the year that James Purrington was born in Bodenham, Maine. He grew up with his parents, David Purrington and Mary Scales, until marrying a woman named Betsy Clifford, who had also grown up in Maine. The couple stayed around Bodenham, where they started to grow their family. Throughout the years, James and Betsy had a total of 12 children, but unfortunately, four of them ended up dying during infancy. The eight remaining children were Polly, Martha, Anna, Louisa, James Jr., Nathaniel, Nathan, and Benjamin. It wasn't until 1805, when James and his family moved to a new farm in Augusta that he had bought with inheritance money from his after his father had died. The plot of land they had bought was around 100 acres, and it took him a couple of years to clear out just 6 acres of that land, so the family would be able to live there. Him spending so much time on the newly acquired farmland lends to how people said that he was an extremely hardworking person who always wanted his family not to suffer through anything bad. The thing with James, which I feel is unlike a good amount of these stories from like way in the past, um, is that we actually get to know a little bit about like the type of person he was and just kind of like who he was because of how involved he was throughout the community back then. He was somebody who always felt responsible for everybody's safety, not just his family's. Um, he was a captain and he was a veteran in the Revolutionary War. So like he had a decent life for him. Um, and there is some like sources of these people that have um, kind of corroborated this. Martha Ballard, who was a midwife at the time, but is also probably one of the most famous people that lived in Maine, especially from this time period. Was a neighbor of the Puritans when they moved to Augusta. There was multiple mentions through some of her diary entries that the family was always good to her. They were good neighbors. Her and Betsy were decent friends, and James would actually help her with certain deliveries or tasks that she had to do for her job. Um, but however, this family man persona of sorts was only one aspect to his life. The other side, which was his darker side, was that of a man who was extremely arrogant. It had been noted by multiple people that he spent time around that James never believed that he was wrong and would rarely admit if he made a mistake. Others would notice how his mood and attitude would drastically change depending on how his finances and farm were doing. The more he succeeded, the happier and more evolved he would be. But if there was a drought or a bad batch of crops, then it would have the opposite effect on him. With today's knowledge of things like mental illness, it's pretty safe to assume that he would have been diagnosed with something, probably some form of depression. But because of the time gap, and it's just not something that you can just say for sure. But the last thing to note about him, um, and who he kind of was his religious beliefs because of the time period, and that's was a very prominent thing in I'd say everybody's life back then, and just like where he stood with the church. So back before they moved to Augusta, there was conflicts between the beliefs that he started to have and then those that the church had that they went to. And there was rumored that his changing in beliefs and how the people of the town thought they were extreme was actually one of the reasons that he decided to leave and move the family to Augusta. Uh, yeah, so this is the time in America when people had started to step away from the traditional religious views, and this thing called universalism became more of a thing. And James was one of those people who believed in it, which, from my understanding, it's the concept of universal salvation, which means that no matter what people do, uh, they don't end up going to hell. They go to a purgatory like place where they wait to be purified and restored. I'm not a religious person. I'm not gonna try to speak on any of that type of stuff. But mixing the newer religious views and how James always wanted his family to be together, uh, it it makes sense, and but it's really creepy to think about that there had actually been times where he would talk to people or would talk to himself, I think, uh, about how happy he would be, or it would be if everybody in the family had died together, which is extremely haunting, especially once I get through the story of the night of the murder and what happened, because there's a lot of, I don't want to say I mean, looking back now, foreshadowing in the sense of storytelling, but it's weird. Yeah. So in the months leading up to the night of July 8th, 1806, Martha Ballard and Betsy would spend time together every now and then, and when they met, they would Betsy would actually confide in her about how she thought James was getting ready to kill himself, and which was something that she had confronted him about multiple times, with which he denied every single time. But a few days prior to the night, Martha, James's daughter, Martha, not Ballard, it, I hate when this happens and it's two prominent people have the same name, because it's always confusing when you're trying to read through stuff. But so she had confronted him about the way he had been acting, and he actually been writing a note to his brother while she was talking to him, and he just played it off, told her there's nothing to worry about, that everything would be okay. Um, it was within the few days after that that Betsy actually also confronted James when she found a note, and she believed it to be a suicide note, which it definitely reads as it, which I'll get to in a second. And obviously, going back to his attitude and what her thoughts were, of what was going through her mind, I can definitely understand why she believed that it would be a suicide note. But just like he did with his daughter, he assured her that it was okay, and he had this presentiment of his approaching death, which is kind of weird to think about. But yeah, so the note goes as follows. Dear brother, these lines to let you know that I am going on a long journey, and I would have you sell what I have and put it out to interest, and put my boys out to trades or send them to sea. I cannot see the distress of my family. God only knows my distress. I would have you put Nathal to Uncle Purrington to a tanner's trade. I want James to go to school until sufficient to attend in a store, Benjamin to a blacksmith's trade, or to what you think is best. But to be sure to give them learning, if it takes all. Divide what is left, for I am no more. And I've read this through multiple times. That last line is like a textbook last line of a suicide note, in a sense, but it's just something that would make you think that way. But now we move on to the night of the massacre. James stayed up late on the night of July 8th, 1806, when the rest of the family went to bed. He was reading his Bible out in one of the main rooms of the house by the candlelight. It was a few hours later, around 2 a.m. of the following morning, that James Jr. awoke to his mother's screams. When he entered the master bedroom, Betsy was dying on the bed, and his father was covered in her blood, axe in hand. James swung the axe at Junior and it hit him in the back, but he was able to get away and run for help. Junior made it all the way down the street to the Wyman residence, where he explained what had happened to Dean Wyman. Dean ended up going to get Martha Ballard's husband, and as well as their son, to help with the situation. And from here, you kind of there's not a lot to go off of, unfortunately, but this is where you would go into Ballard's journal entry that she had written about that night. They too went to the house where the horrid scene was perpetrated. My son went in and found a candle, which he lit, and to his great surprise saw Purrington, his wife, and 6 children's corpses. Martha, he had perceived, had life remaining, who was removed to his house. Surgical aid was immediately called, and she remains alive yet. My husband went and returned before sunrise, when after taking a little food, he and I went on to the house there to behold the most shocking scene that was even seen in this part of the world. May an infinitely good God grant that we may all take suitable notice of this horrid deed, learn wisdom therefrom. The corpses were removed to his barn, where they were washed and laid out side by side. A horrid spectacle which many hundred persons came to behold. I was there till near night, when son Jonathan conducted me to his house and gave me refreshment. The coffins were brought, and the corpses carried in a wagon and deposited in the Augusta meeting house. So that was her, like, what she had written down about that night. There's no written record of like specifics, like within that few hours, because I mean, outside of James Jr., because Martha, the daughter Martha, ended up dying from her injuries at the end of the month. So James Jr. was the only living survivor of this whole thing, and from what I could see, and even like other people that have done the research, there is no first like account of something that came from him of what happened, what he saw. But then again, even if there was, he ran off, so he wouldn't even have known if something happened after he had left. When the bodies were found, it was noted how each of them had died, which I have it summarized. It's not super, super graphic. But so Betsy had multiple wounds to her head, neck, and her torso. Anna was dead at her feet. Polly had multiple axe wounds and was in one of the other rooms. Martha was still alive at that time, and she was near Polly, but also leaning on Louisa, which is the baby, who was dead at only 18 months old, which is really sad. Benjamin was found dead near the fireplace, and his blood-covered handprint was actually on the wall, which kind of shows that he did make an attempt to escape. Nathaniel and Nathan were both found with their throats slit, and then James was also found with his throat slit as well. After the rest of the events described in Ballard's journal happened, the town ended up holding a funeral for the family. Betsy and all the children who had died were buried together in the cemetery, which the grave is still marked today. And then James was buried with the axe and the blade that he used in the killings in some unmarked grave that was like basically just off the side of the road. So he wouldn't, I believe the belief there was that with having them separated, he wouldn't be able to like interfere with their afterlife in a sense, depending on what you believe. Not long after, the coroner and jury were gathered to officially convict James of the crime, even though he was already dead. There were 2 different like decisions reports that were made. One was that he did it while having a manic episode of what they called hereditary insanity, and then the other report didn't mention anything like that. It just stated that he had premeditated the murders, and that was it. And just people throughout time have chimed in on why they think he was killed, but there was always one man that had a claim, which this goes into religious aspects and like the ties of the church that he was in before. Timothy Merritt was James's old minister from back before they moved to Augusta, and he believed that James did it because of his shift in religious beliefs. He claimed that it was done because if the next world was better than the one that they were in, James would have done the family a favor in the sense by bringing them there with him. And it was with this that Merritt stood on his own beliefs that hell is a real place and not everyone can be saved. Because, and the way I've kind of understood it is because of the universalism belief and the universal salvation. James basically made it, or wanted to make it so his family was always going to be together. So, I mean, in his eyes, what better way to do it than the way he did it? Because they're all going to die at the same time, which is something he wanted, kind of, anyways. But it would also allow them all to be in the afterlife together based on his own beliefs. And the last thing that I did kind of want to talk about real quick was that the Bible was actually opened to the 9th chapter of the book of Ezekiel when they found all the bodies. And the part that it was, and this is kind of what it says. He cried also into mine ears with a loud voice, saying, cause them that have charge over the city to draw near, even every man with his destroying weapon in hand. Let not your eyes spare, neither have ye pity. Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man of whom is the mark. And it's like, that's, coupled that with the presentiment of death, with the suicide note, quote unquote, like, it is very haunting with everything that occurred throughout the night. And, and that's where you kind of get all the religious tie-ins, because you get the Bible, you get, like, this sense of, like, this is what's gonna happen, this is the fate, like, this is my fate, about his, like, him believing he's gonna die soon. But then, on the other side of it, you also get the, like, the not known at the time, but, like, the mental health aspect of, like, is he just, like, psychotic? Because this is something that wouldn't have been diagnosed or even looked at back then, because they didn't know. There was one thing that I do wish there was more on in general, and that's, like, about James's childhood, because you get, like, his parents' names and, like, where he grew up, and that's about it. You don't get to know what his childhood was like what type of people his parents were, and this is something you see a lot with when digging into modern serial killer or murder cases, is that the criminals were usually, like, not always, but a good amount, like, they were abused as a child, or there was some sort of prolonged traumatic experience that happens when they were younger that kind of, like, shifts their mindset to be a lot darker than it should be. But that's the one thing I wish I could be able to, like, have in front of me of, like, not say, because obviously what he did was horrible, but, like, when you look through modern cases, you see, like, a little bit of that shift in attitude or just, like, personal beliefs, and you understand, like, that could be a catalyst for what had happened and, like, why they chose to do certain things. But without that, there's so much unknown about, like, his younger life, which I hate. Yeah. But yeah, it was a shorter one because, it's a 250-year-old case, or almost 250-year-old case. So it's all very small amounts of sources, and it's all primary sources of the journal or, like, the news story that came out back then. But I just want to say thank you all for joining me for this week. and listening to this episode, and I will see you all at some point next week. Peace.